back again for another one. Today, I was on the verge of deleting everything you see behind me, but then I realized I would just be giving you guys the short end of the stick because then I would erase so much of what actually matters. Alright, today I found some incredible information that I think will help you put this big puzzle all together. We usually ponder on what is the meaning of life because we are all curious beings that are looking for the origins of where we come from. And I want to share a small story with you that might help you understand things better. I've been waking up every single day for the last 10 years to study this subject, as it is a very, very important, curious subject of mine that I'm particularly crazy and obsessed over because religion has clouded our perception of the origins of life. Now, the concept of religion is just as important as the concept of marriage. These are cultural programmings that have been instilled in us so that we can kind of perceive the world under a certain microscope or through a certain lens that doesn't necessarily apply to the truth about what it is to be a human. And ultimately, that's what I'm here to find out. I've been able to learn how to feed myself, feed my family, take care of my body, connect with my family, and I've been able to learn how to play the game of America. So now that my foundation is set, now that everything has been prepared, I'm finally able to discuss one of the most important subject matters that there's actually been, so that hopefully if my children ever see this content, they'll be able to understand the root of the issue, but more importantly, you too can understand the foundation of where our religions come from, because ultimately it's all about understanding the foundation of everything that we currently stand on. And I want to share with you a little bit more about what America was founded on. But more importantly, I want to share with you two important bloodlines that I think you got to keep in mind besides the royal bloodline. Because when you think about history, not his story, but history, as in the major timeline of the human evolution and innovation, right? Because evolution means to adapt to a certain environment. Innovation means to create out of your environment to help you further yourself in that environment. And both of these situations are applicable to humans along their timeline of development. But most of us want to think of time being represented by history. And this is where things begin to get a little cloudy. You see, history is a manipulation of time so that we can dilute the way that you perceive the history or the story of humans. Because it's not his story, it's the story of humans. And if we could flip those words around, I think you too will be able to start comprehending where I will begin today's lesson. Today's real simple. You must understand where the human story began because of the last catastrophe that we suffered. You need to understand how we survived it, how we overcame it, and how we repopulated the earth. Because if you don't understand these things, then you'll often be led towards misconceptions or lies that are hidden below these biblical or scriptures of religious precedents. So I'm excited to go ahead and cover this with you. Let me go ahead and get a quick sip and let's get started. You know, everything here began because of my curiosity of understanding how old was the oldest human that has ever been found. You know, that was the number one thing I was curious about. All right, the story of humans begins in what do we know about the past and what can we prove? Because we can speculate, but ultimately it's about what we could prove. Now, I wasn't able to find any deep history that connects further back than 10,000 years from the BC, all right, before current era, or BCE. And so I created a small timeline right here, as you can see, from 10,000 years ago. That was the Neolithic Revolution, or what we say as the end of the Ice Age, where basically we began to see the thawing out of these glaciers on the ice caps of the world on the north and south. Because remember, Due to catastrophic events, we can see the climate change, and this forces people to migrate towards warmer and higher or more uh, uh, an altitude where the sea level can't really reach them. You have to keep this in mind because every time there's a catastrophic world event, I'm going to describe a few. I want you to think of the movie Greenland. Meteor comes down, or asteroid. They're both different. Once again, a meteor, if I'm not mistaken, is just a rock that's basically covered in ice, or it's a ball of ice, and as it travels through space, it starts to melt. But an asteroid is an actual rock that doesn't melt, it just actually impacts. And so we got to think of the two, right? One is massive impact, the other one is going to disintegrate, hopefully, by the time that it arrives. If not, it's just a big, massive ball of ice, if I'm not mistaken. So the two are basically, one is going to impact the Earth, and depending on the location where it hits, we're going to see catastrophic worldwide events. This could mean that we have earthquakes immediately after the impact, or if it hits in the water, we have tsunamis, and then earthquakes. Earthquakes underwater that then cause the tsunami, and then we can see all this type of global changes, whether it's a destruction of the land, or whether it's an impact on the Earth that causes a massive global freezing because the sunlight is being obstructed because of how much debris was lifted up into the air. And so you got to think of these two scenarios, right? Debris, tsunami. Now these are two global events that major cultures around the world have all shared with us. They've talked about how there was the Great Flood, and then there's also this great idea of people freezing, right, in the North and South Pole because of global changes. And so what we have here is that weather dictates where humans live. Therefore, humans can discover new land if they learn how to have a symbiotic relationship with the climate and the CO2 levels, seawater levels, to repopulate accordingly. Can you imagine? All right, can you imagine if there was this major freeze? Everybody would run to, you guessed it, the Mediterranean. Everybody would go to the Mediterranean because near the equator is where it's the warmest, the middle. If this seems to be true, this would make sense why we were able to start repopulating from these areas. That does not mean, though, however, that humans were not able to survive during these cold temperatures. A lot of humans were able to survive by shifting their diet from not necessarily eating big game, but now focusing on water animals and becoming like Eskimos, let's say, right? People in like Russia, Siberia, they learn how to live in the cold. They've lived there for many years. You can think of the Rus, all right? The Rus that became eventually Russia, or the Rus. All right, you got to think of these people. They've survived there for a long time, like the Mongolians. They've survived in the cold for a very, very long time, and I want you to think about why. All right, just ponder on that. But then we got to look at the other side of the world, where we have the Hopi, where they went underground, and we have stories that they come from underground, and they were able to survive all these catastrophic events because they lived underground. So that makes you wonder, did only one race of humans spur out of nowhere, or did multiple races of humans spur at the same time or birth at the same time in different areas? You see, I have a hypothesis or this theory that it's not about the evolution of humans, but it's the innovation versus evolution of human, right? The retrospective view of the salvation of the human soul through this game of reverse engineering, all right? So I want you to think, humans had to innovate to be where we're at right now. We didn't evolve, but yet we did blend and kind of become hybrids by blending our cultures, by blending our DNA, and by blending our genetic codes. You gotta understand that there were different races being brought up or being birthed throughout the earth at different times. We have the Aryan in Europe, we have in Mesopotamia, we have, the black or the Africans, and then we have the Hopi, which are the Native Americans in the Americas. All right, so we have different groups being brought up in different areas. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a first. That's not to say that there wasn't a next. We obviously understand that Mesopotamia and Africa had one of the earliest places of life and knowledge. So we understand that, no doubt. the Hopi and the Africans did not really write down. That was actually more of a technological development of Europeans. That was actually how they were able to communicate better. There was spoken language and spoken culture in these two, but this was written language. So that puts them ahead. By being able to be ahead, a technological advantage gives you ultimately, let's say, more etiquette. You know a little bit more about how the body works, and you can express it better to others, because the idea is to share ideas, right? So that means that the whites were able to start creating these types of government to be able to manage the growing population, because I want you to think about it, all right? You can't go from a small tribe to a big nation overnight without having governance. Now, what is governance? All right, it's to govern the mind. All right, government. This means that people themselves don't know how to control themselves, so there has to be a way to control the minds of the people, because people are not innately good. People are coming from a place of, if your parents were at the lower end of the spectrum, you're obviously feeling deficient in some kind of way or another, so you're always trying to go ahead and get ahead. You're always looking for a way up. You're always looking to change your stars. But what happens is the people up top don't want to lose their spot. And so there has to be these systems of protection and regulation. And you need to understand that, because if you don't, then you're not playing by the game. And so you need to learn how to educate yourself. Once again, the very first step, besides learning how to speak the language, is to write the language. Once you learn to speak it, you learn to write it, then you got to learn the legal foundation of the language. And this is where things start to get funky, because most people don't understand what is canon law. All right, canon law is basically the religious law that applies within the Christian or the religious sectors. All right, in this case, the Vatican. So the Vatican is ruled over by what is canon law. This means that there could be lawyers that specifically focus on canon law. This means law that applies to those within the papacy or the papacy. And so you need to understand these things, so that way when you approach the real world, you don't feel like the world is kind of lying to you. It is just simply a little bit more complex than you originally thought. And if you do your research, you'll understand where we're going with this. The most important thing that you have to understand, that coming out of our Neolithic Revolution, is that we have to follow certain ancestral rituals that we had. This is the key, right? Because if we don't follow what our ancestors created, then we feel kind of lost. Like, if you don't do the celebrations or the holidays that you used to do when you were little, you somewhat feel like you detach from who your roots were. And this is the whole point of parents passing down knowledge to you. You see, the next layer of ancestral rituals that create our new identity every single day is, if you choose to accept them, right? Because your identity determines your behavior. And what most of us do is we don't recognize who we are every single day, so that we feel empowered, 1, 2, responsible, 3, then we can claim our rights for whatever we want. But first you have to put yourself in the right state of deserving, because of what it means to your family and the pride that your family has gone through to get to where you're at. Most people don't go back to their roots every single day. And so by not giving attention to your ancestral roots, you essentially disconnect from what is your true self. And so most of us have to think, okay, we have to find a way to blend our ancestral roots with, I would say, methods of connecting to the source. All right, and people would say that this is meditation. In my personal opinion, in order to really connect to the source, you need to find some type of psychedelic that your brain can tolerate to first introduce you to what is called altered states of consciousness. People need to understand that altered states of consciousness is the way that we start opening up ourselves towards new neurological connections, as well as neuroplasticity through experiences, because ultimately the brain is just like a remote control. You could change the channels and it can change the way that it perceives things, because your eyes are merely a tool of the brain to understand how to perceive different lights, vibrations, and sounds because of your ears. So we need to understand how to manipulate these tools so that they can help us unlock the true human potential. So by being able to leverage your peace of mind, by keeping yourself on path, by following your ancestral path or your ancestral rituals, and then using your 24 hours correctly to use psychedelic rituals to help you improve that connection to the divine, so that way when you go through your day-to-day routine, you don't feel stressed but simply guided, that everything that you are doing, it's ultimately for the bigger cause. This is all just a growing step. And so if you are able to participate in these psychedelic rituals that are just right, once again, they have to be appropriate to your current level of health, trauma, mental health, stress and pain tolerance, otherwise known as nociception. All these things play a big role in how someone can introduce psychedelics to you. And you need to understand that yes, in the past, these people have been called shaman, healers, but for the most part, here in America, that has been removed since the 1850s or 60s, if I'm not mistaken, once the AMA came into play to remove the connection to the divine by implementing medicine instead of plants, implementing surgery instead of movements. And I need you to understand that this is when things start to get funky, because if you understand the history of America and the regulation and the legislation, then you can understand why so many of these things that are just true to us, true to nature, true to the divine, have been removed from us. Because now there's a policy created by those that created language first, because they created language under a certain type of structure, which is called legalese, or the language of the Holy See. And so when we start thinking about this, legalese, the language of the Holy See, it starts to go ahead and create a different twist on every word that we speak. And because of that, if you're not able to go ahead and introduce to your lifestyle practices of wisdom that allow you to break down the wording, the etymology, and the proper utilization of each word, because you have to remember, these daily practices of wisdom are not only collecting information to share information, but it also means that you collect information to self-analyze yourself under that information, and then ask questions to others that you respect or look up to see how they perceive that information. If others can give you good feedback on that information or kind of elaborate further, then this will allow you not only to get information, but to process information, utilize information, and then ultimately redefine what this information is so that it can help you create a better identity of yourself. Most of us don't realize that information becomes your identity if you choose to accept it. And that's the most important thing here. By practicing, rituals of wisdom, meaning not only do you research, not only do you read, not only do you listen, not only do you ask, not only do you write, but you also speak. And when you talk, you listen. And when you talk, you ask more questions. That's the key, right? Being able to get information and share with others, because others are going to need it. Now, as we move on, that wisdom will either prepare you or keep you in the dark from what is called our global catastrophes, right? Because if you realize that there has been 6 generations of humans in the past, then you realize that these generations that came before us have created what is called an astrological calendar of certain things that happen in cyclical manners. So this means that if it happened every 24,000 years or 26,000 years, they knew about it, right? Because there had been a proof, of written proof or a spoken proof or a cultural proof of what is an anticipation of an event. Most of us know now that there are monoliths established around the world, where there are sacred places where if at a certain time the sun strikes correctly, certain things are revealed because of the stone's positioning. And we need to understand that, because Stonehenge was previously the one that we looked at as, okay, this is an ancient calendar that tells us, based upon the astrological positioning of the stones, what we could expect at certain times. But now there's been discovery of Göbekli Tepe, where we can understand more in like Turkish area that there is a huge transformation in the way that we used to perceive the world, because there's been multiple world catastrophic events where once again the asteroids were able to impact the earth and cause civilization to move into different planes to survive, or to shift their nutritional patterns in order to survive. And so we got to recognize these things, because not one specific way of nutrition is correct. Nonetheless, we have to also play in mind, have this thought in mind, that as much as nutrition matters, I think it's more about how does the human soul survive through these different various catastrophic events. Because essentially we are always either learning to survive, repopulate, or manage these overwhelming growths of population. You may have heard that humans are like bacteria, and it's true. We go ahead and expand, we rapidly, and more than anything, we consume and have incredible amount of waste. And you need to look at everything that you do in that way, because you have to think of what you consume and what you create as waste. It's essentially all going to be judged under one scale. All right, the scale of, is it benefiting society or is it not benefiting society? Right, because if you're essentially just consuming food just to go ahead and be a consumer and not really a producer, you're just on this side of the scale where you're constantly weighing down society and you're just a burden. But if you go ahead and utilize your 24 hours to consume, yeah, you'll create some kind of waste. But at the same time, that waste is equally as important as the amount of value that you create to society. Then somewhat you're leveling out the scales. And it's the most important thing to keep in mind, that you have to level the scales in 24 hours. Not only nutritionally, not only consumptionally, but more than anything, it's like, what do you do socially for the community, so that way there's an even balance, right? You're not just taking from society. But the way that society is right now is that we are so accustomed to going ahead and having everything on demand and on delivery, that I have a feeling that if that was to be cut off from us, most of us wouldn't know what to do. This is why it's important to have awareness of what to do in case of an emergency where there's no electricity or there's no access to your banks. And this is what we're talking about, because the history of banks is actually where we start to go south. You see, we started depending on these institutions to provide us with either a space for saving our wealth or to sustain our storage of wealth. And we also started seeing them as opportunity to get credit on our word or integrity in order to get ahead. And this is where most people fall off, because you see, there's no way you could take out a loan that you don't think you could pay back. That affects your mental state. If you don't pay back that loan, you don't look at yourself the same way in the mirror. And then when you don't look at yourself the same way in the mirror, it affects your overall productivity. Now you're lazy, maybe you're a drinker, maybe you're now going ahead and being aggressive. All these different habits are all derived out of how you look at yourself in the mirror, based upon how you perceive yourself in a financial manner. You see, most of us look at our financial state or our bank account as what determines our mood. And the truth is, if you see that your bank account is in negative, obviously you're going to feel like you're running out of time, or that there's pressure on you. And if you don't get yourself out of that situation, things are not going to be okay. People don't know what is actually going on internally, but I'm sure that you know. I felt that way. I understand exactly what it means to feel rushed or pressured due to a deficiency in a financial state. And that leads to mental stress or mental overwhelming thoughts, emotions, and this causes you to react aggressively towards the world or timidly. And you need to think of this as, is this hindering your overall potential, right? Because if you're not seeing yourself as the person that can actually go ahead and speak from those places with authority, right, then you're basically looking down on yourself. And the goal is to always forgive yourself for what you've done and find a way to get out of that situation. Because if you can forgive yourself, create a plan, and get out of that situation, you can be in a better place. But what's tend to happen here is that at a certain point in time, this concept of religion was introduced, which caused individuals to give up permission of how their belief system was being created, and therefore they stopped believing in whatever they thought was best, and they started believing this idea that somebody wrote down being the idea of salvation. You see, the idea of salvation is not wrong, because we as a race of humans need to understand what will best provide the body nourishment in order to recreate itself, sustain itself, and expand its lifetime. But at the same time, in these doctrines or in these rituals or in these writings, we start to realize that there could be manipulation of the direction that a human can go. Because if you start writing down that humans should only eat vegetables, humans will only eat vegetables if that's what it says. But if it says humans should only eat meat, then that's what it'll do. And you got to realize these things, because if these are the most ancient texts written in order to reach salvation, then it starts kind of providing some kind of blueprint or a guide to follow towards salvation. And this is why they say that the keys to the gate of heaven are held by the Pope, because they say that the Pope bloodline has been able to acquire the first written text of what Jesus had taught or spoken about, written down by Peter. And so we start to realize that this entire lineage of the papacy was to keep the word of Jesus alive. Well, that's great. We understand why that bloodline was there. But was humanity alive before Jesus was there? Yeah. And so Jesus is, or the story of that individual, which is called our current history, which is why we have AD, Anno Domini, or before Christ, right? You could say. The idea of these concepts is just to give you a point in time throughout the story of human evolution. But that's not to say that that's the only history or the only truth. And so, in my words, I want to share with you the truth about religion, which is the permission to control the perspective of life. You see, if I am able to go ahead and agree to a specific system of religion, I'm basically saying, yep, the way that they live is correct. Yep, the way that they live is correct, as opposed to all the others. And that's not correct. What you need to understand is your role in the ecosystem, instead of trying to define yourself as something in the ecosystem. It's not important to define yourself. It's important to participate, right? And defining is different than participating, in the sense of, in defining yourself, you could stand back and say, hey, look, that group needs to go ahead and do something. In participating, you can understand the big role in that, you know what, your actions actually do matter. Whatever you do actually does play a big role. Maybe not today, but maybe in 2 or 3 years. And so that's really where we start to think about things in a different way. And that's called conversion. But you see, if I don't help you convert the way that you perceive this whole concept of religion, well, you're either going to go ahead and continue with your old ways, once again, the old ways, which is either you're going to grow or reject it, right? Or you're going to question it. The old way, right here, means that you're going to fight me. The old way means that if you don't think that what I'm saying is correct, it means you're going to fight what I'm saying, because it doesn't make sense to be connected to the nature or to the source, which I'll explain to what it really means. But the idea is you want to be connected to the idea of a man being the solution. Well, the idea of a man being the solution is not really the solution, but it's simply just a role model of what you could become if you actually became a disciple of these practices. Instead of trying to go ahead and wait for a savior, you can actually become, with 24 hours every day, you could change the way that you move, so that essentially you are nothing but a God on earth, to be able to create as you please. When you acquire enough wealth, when you acquire enough wisdom, when you acquire enough patience, when you acquire enough skills, when you acquire enough, enough abilities to be able to congregate without arguments, then you will be able to create and manifest as you please, because it is the delegation and automation of communication that allows for creation. And if you don't understand these things, I don't blame you, but it's just a process of development that will allow you to go ahead and get from where you are today, once again, by connecting to your ancestral rituals, pursuing psychedelic rituals that allow you to go ahead and separate from reality to understand the source, and then use that to help you find better practices of wisdom daily, which ultimately will give you an awareness of when these global catastrophes are projected to occur, because this is what determines the rhythm of humanity. The leaders of humanity are paying attention to these cosmic and astrological events for a reason. If they are not aware of these global events or these astrological events, then how can they help society anticipate what's coming? Whether it's just them trying to save themselves and their legacy, or it's them writing down for future legacies what they've learned. Meaning, if I was, Bill Gates, right, and I look back on my lineage, because he actually has a bloodline that goes back to 1566, as far as we could tell. 1566, I want you to think about that, because that runs right along the lines of when the first few kings of England were being introduced or knighted, or being put in charge. And so this makes you wonder if the early legacy of, or ancestors of Bill Gates, Eustace Gates, knew exactly what was going on, or he happened to find out, then he shared it with his son, and then they shared it with his son. You see what I'm saying? So they can prepare each other for what's coming. And so for the last few generations, once again, going back around 6 or 7 generations, we arrive at Eustace Gates, which was born in 1566 to 1636, if I'm not mistaken. But the idea is, think on how many generations have they been passing down knowledge and wisdom and history through, right? It goes in a different direction than what religion has been taught. He actually has been shared all the technological advances. He's been involved with eugenics and the population control and everything that requires technological advancements for a reason. But most people don't seem to realize that bloodlines, technology, businesses, and organizations play a big role in the world. So for the next few days, I want you to ponder on the information here. I'll be doing some more content specifically on this behind me, so that we can all understand how simple it could be, because it really does start like this: as above, so below, in heaven and earth, astrology and reality. As I mentioned, if you don't know what's coming, you can't prepare. Therefore, you don't know what brain state to be in. You never want to be in a state of fear. You actually want to be in a state of creation. Meditation and peace will help you go ahead and achieve these different brain states that will let you anticipate what's coming and move with awareness. Once again, the truth behind our reality is that we have had different generations try to explain to us what life is through a story of gods and time. But in reality, it's all about your current frequency in order to create, based upon the sounds, the visuals, the colors, the actions, the hormones, everything that you're going through. But that ultimately depends on your current level of electricity or alkalinity and magnetism, right? And so we got to think about these two as being one, because that is the dance that we spend our entire day playing, or the fight that we spend our entire day fighting. This balance between electricity and magnetism, because that's why most individuals are lacking energy. They are not very radiant, or they're not very energetic. This is why, because this is off in their body, which essentially throws off their frequency, which therefore does not let them create. And if they can't create, then they are victims to how these stories are, because they are now not seeing time for what it actually is, but they are being slaves to time instead of being able to take advantage of time. And you need to see it in a different way, because if you were able to go ahead and realign both your electric and magnetic self, meaning your right and left hemispheres of the brain, meaning your your male or feminine energies, they gotta be synchronized, because that means that you have what is called self-care and self-direction. All right, self-care and self-direction. This is all it means. If you don't have self-direction, that means that you rely on the father to guide you, right? But if you don't have self-care, then you rely on your mother to go ahead and take care of you. So you need to go ahead and think about these two, because self-direction and self-care It's a dance of discipline, and most people don't have that discipline, so they are victims to time, and then they feel like they're always behind. So make sure you stay on time, and you now pay attention to what magnetism and electricity could do to your life. Because once you understand that it's a battle or a dance between your right and left hemisphere, then you can see how it's all about logic and art. Because this dance of logic and art is what dictates your ability to be creative, to reach imagination, or to be able to go ahead and to create something that solves the world's problems. But you need to first put yourself in a state of meditation to understand what your personal problems are and separate them from what is the world problems, and what are your personal skills that you can use to implement into that world problem, and maybe hopefully one day innovate it, hopefully solve it. Because if you could solve it, then once again you can continue life and innovate life, because that is what leads towards the path of sacred geometry, the opportunity of life. Meaning life is created in such a way through sacred geometry, and if you haven't heard about it, you should probably get on it. But what you'll learn about sacred geometry is, if you notice this right here, this shape, this is why they do this. This right here, this simple shape, it's right there. This is the seed. Those that know, understand. Once again, when they go ahead and try to hit you with that finger and they try to go like this, it's because you need to know global catastrophic events. And if you know what I'm saying now, then you can prepare yourself for what's coming by studying what is going on in the astrological planes, in the cosmic planes, instead of just here on the earth. Because you are being told to keep your head down when really you should be looking up, so that way you can be inspired to go ahead and prepare by anticipation, and therefore your actions would lead you to find balance between the sun and the moon. That is called your circadian rhythm, which will allow you to reset your hormones so that you can be aligned once again to the earth. Because the sun and the moon determines the patterns of your hormones and the patterns of your mood. And if you are able to go ahead and see the story that we're telling here, the sun and the moon are basically another story of above and below, heaven and earth. So I hope that with a little bit more of this information, you can see the truth about religion, which is just a way of getting you to step away, or to stop thinking, or to stop being curious, and to start believing in specific systems or ideas that you don't question. Obviously, we want to break away from that, because the Bible, if we can start shifting our mind or perception of what it actually is, and we start thinking along the lines of what is the human story and where does it lie in the human story, then the Bible is actually just a global agreement of a point in time when language, culture, art, perspective, beliefs, they were all being described and tracked to help us understand what is the cost and what is the path for those that maybe have lost their way. Because the way is to understand this, to understand this, to understand that life is being found by a balance of the sun and the moon. This is why we have these major catastrophic events, such as eclipses, right? Or lunar events, solar events, where the sun passes in front of one or the other. And you need to understand that these alignments can be predicted, and they have been. So do your research, do a little bit more pursuit of awareness and research in the astrological bodies, because once you understand how electricity and magnetism were created through the planetary bodies, then you can understand why you have certain things going on in your life, or why you are going through certain moods or situations in your life. And if you can anticipate when you'll be getting out of those things, maybe you can change your perception and become more patient. Because the truth is, all you have is time. Learn to use it wisely, learn to be about your life, and help yourself break the cycle. I know you can do it. Thanks for watching.